Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you on the call and to those joining. I'm Doug Gollin and one of the organizers of this course, along with Joe Kaboski and our speaker today, Richard Rogerson. And I want to welcome you all to today's lecture in the STEG course on key concepts in macroeconomic development. As most of you know by now, this course is organized through STEG, which is a research program on structural transformation and economic growth. The STEG program is funded and supported by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom as part of the UK aid effort. And we are delighted to have today, I've lost track of what number lecture this is, but today we have the continuing lecture of the main lecture series from Richard Rogerson, who kicked us off with the very opening lecture of the series. And Richard's going to talk today about misallocation at the level of firms. And we're really grateful to him again for making the time available and for putting the effort into preparing this talk. Just to give you a reminder of what the rules of the game are, Richard will lecture. I believe he's open to questions and interruptions from the small set of you who are in the virtual front row. Those of you who have your cameras and control your cameras and microphones should feel free to, I think you have control of the raise hand feature on Zoom. And if you're raising your hand and not getting any response, you can try to blurt out a question. You can just interrupt. Please keep questions brief if possible. For the rest of you, if you're just on the call as an audience member, you won't have access to the raise hand, or if you do, we can't respond to it. But if you enter questions in the Q&A, Joe and I will do our best to respond, and anyone else who feels they want to weigh in as well, we'll keep a conversation going there during the lecture and try to answer as many questions as we can. So on that note, I think, Richard, I'll turn it over to you. And again, with great thanks, you'll talk for about an hour and a quarter or so, and then save a little bit of time for Q&A at the end, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the plan, Doug. So thanks for the introduction. And yeah, just to comment on some of what Doug said, feel free, those of you who are in the so-called front row, feel free to interrupt with questions. I think as a practical matter, it's not necessarily that easy for me to see you raise your hand or anything. So, I mean, I would just encourage you, if you have a question, just kind of shout it out, interrupt and shout it out, that's fine. Or as Doug said, if you put something in chat, then he or Joe may try to answer it. So anyways, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so there we are. So this is the first of a couple of lectures in the regular series on misallocation, and I'll start with a little bit of motivation. So for those of you who've been tuning into the earlier lectures, I mean, I talked a little bit about these issues my opening lecture, but I know you also had a lecture, multiple lectures on growth accounting exercises. And while that remains an ongoing literature and there's issues still to be worked out, I mean, as you know from those, a common result in that literature is that aggregate differences in TFP are an important source of cross-country differences in living standards. And starting from that, it raises the question, of course, is what are the forces that shape TFP differences? And I guess if you are used to thinking about the Solo model and using it to describe the evolution of a currently advanced economy, talking about the UK, the United States, or some other Western European economies, or Japan, you kind of are taught that TFP is kind of a stand-in for technological progress. The Industrial Revolution was the beginning of these massive technological innovations, which had a huge impact on our ability to produce different types of goods and services. And so you're kind of taught at an early stage to kind of identify the big A in front of the production function with technological change. And so if I tell you that one country has a smaller big A than another country, you're naturally led to think somehow technology has not diffused to that country. And so certainly one key channel for thinking about differences in TFP is the diffusion of technologies or more generally best practice methods. I think it's important to keep in mind that TFP, we call it technology, but lots of the things which are in some ways part of technology are not necessarily scientific advances in some technical sense. I think kind of the classic example I always tell students about is Henry Ford and the assembly line. There was no patent, there's no big innovation in the lab. It's not a scientific, it's a different way of organizing things. So it's a best practice method. So that's certainly one way to think about it. But I want to the whole motivation for today's lecture is that may not be the whole story in terms of thinking about why TFP might be low in one country relative to another. And if you just think a little bit deeper about what goes on in an economy, you think about all the different activities in an economy and the different people doing those different activities, who's doing what, then you could imagine in a given economy, taking as given this state of technology that's present in that economy, who does what, how things are allocated, that could have a big impact on how much output the economy produces. What if you've got the wrong people making the important decisions? Then these seem like they could be first order things. And so that's kind of what the misallocation literature is all about, is this idea that even taking the state of overall technology and use of best practices as given, there's a lot of, I mean, the resource allocation in a modern economy involves a lot of details in terms of where resources are allocated across different tasks and activities, who's doing them. And so the essence of the misallocation literature is to think about the possibility that different economies are differentially good at handling that problem. And kind of a key starting point to this is if you start thinking about that, the first thing you realize is that models that start with an aggregate production function aren't going to be very helpful here. That if you start with an aggregate production function, you've kind of taken a reduced form approach, and that big A in front of the aggregate production function would necessarily be a combination of both best practice methods and technology in use and how resources are being allocated. And so the motivation for the misallocation literature is to kind of open up that aggregate production function, think about all the different types of decisions that get made in an economy and all the dimensions to resource allocation, and think about the possibility that differences in across economies and how effective they are at handling those resource allocation problems might in fact be an important contributor to TFP differences. And so that's kind of the starting point. Here's an outline for what I'm hoping to do today. And I guess I want to emphasize, in part, this is the first of 2 lectures on misallocation. And as the title for the lecture said, this is really largely about benchmark models of misallocation and then an application showing some early results. And so a lot of the lecture is actually going to focus on introducing you to the models that are common that you need to have facility with if you want to work in the misallocation literature. And so what I would say about this lecture is not going to be a survey of results where I kind of tell you what the current state of understanding is about misallocation. The object of today's literature, today's lecture, is to kind of give you access to the tools so that you can actually contribute to the literature on misallocation. So Pete Klenow is going to give a lecture, I know, next week, and he's going to talk a bit more about current results. but today in some ways is kind of more about the foundation. If you want to work on misallocation, these are kind of the tools you need to have some facility with. And so the first thing we're going to do is introduce you to some benchmark models of misallocation, which is basically going to be the models we talk about today are going to be models that emphasize the fact that the total output in the economy is what you get from adding up the output across individual firms. And importantly, those individual firms are going to be heterogeneous. So we're going to have a lot of production units that are heterogeneous. And in a setting like that, a key part of resource allocation is how resources get allocated to those heterogeneous units. Having done that, we'll kind of have a clear sense of, in the context of those sorts of models, what are the effects that can lead to differences in aggregate TFP, and that'll help us highlight the role of misallocation per se. And then I'm going to talk about two early papers in the literature that have some results. So one paper I have with Diego Restuccia, and then kind of the seminal paper in the literature, the 2009 QJE paper by Shea and Klenow. I'll close with just a couple of issues. So with that, I'm going to jump in. So to say at its core, we want to think about models in which we think about aggregate output in the economy being produced by a lot of heterogeneous producers. And so there's three main models that you will come across for people who think about those want to think in that framework. One of these is the Hoppenheim model, a second one, the Melitz model, and third, the Lucas span of control model. So I want to introduce you to all three of those models. There's a sense in which the details differ, but there's a lot of common structure and common economics across those models. But again, if you want to work in this literature, you kind of need to have a little bit of working knowledge of these models. And so I'm going to, the first part of the lecture, the goal is to kind of introduce you to these models. I'm going to build them up in 3 steps. So step 1, I'm going to talk about static models in which there are multiple production units, but actually no heterogeneity. So that's just to kind of get us going. So that's a small step away from an aggregate production function. Then step 2, we're going to introduce heterogeneity into those static models. And then step 3 is we're going to have dynamic models with heterogeneity. So let me jump in. I'm going to start with the Hoppenheim model. And I guess, as I said, I'm starting with kind of baby versions of all of these models. So I'm going to talk about static models and right now with no heterogeneity. So this is kind of the building block of a Hoppenheim model. So in this version that I want to introduce you to, we're going to have a single household, so a representative household, just like in the standard growth model. This representative household is going to have 1 unit of time. There's going to be a single good in this economy, or you could say a single final good. And this representative household just cares about how much they consume of this single good. So they've got a utility function U of C. Okay, so that's all on the household side, just completely standard. You could think of it as just a static snapshot of the 1 sector growth model, a household with a unit of time, and they value consumption of the final good. Now, on the production side, that's where we deviate from the aggregate production function. So the unit of production is going to be a plant. And a key part of this model is that there's a technology for creating plants. And how do you create a plant? You create a plant by using some labor. And so in particular, H bar units of labor can create 1 plant. What does it mean to create a plant? When you create a plant, you basically have access to a production function for this plant. And the production function for this plant is you give it some labor and it produces some of the output. And it has a Z in front of this function, small f. And a key feature of the Hoppenheim model is that this function f is decreasing returns to scale, and that's not just a cosmetic assumption or a detail. This is kind of at the core of the economics of this model. Okay, so that's the Hoppenheim model, and as I say, it's a model which deviates from an aggregate production function by saying that no, production takes place in things called plants, and we actually need to actually create these plants. So it has a technology for creating a plant, and then once you've created the plants, that gives you your ability to produce output. So that's the Hoppenheim model, this simple building block of it. The Melitz model has, say, some elements in common. I say on the top here, in some ways, this is really Dixit-Stiglitz, for those of you who are familiar with the literature, and Melitz in some ways is like a embedding the original Dixit-Stiglitz into a dynamic model with firm entry and exit and such. But I'm just going to call it Melitz because we're headed into building up to the full model. So as in the Hoppenheim model, we don't do anything on the household side. It just looks like a static snapshot of the one sector growth model, a single household, a unit of time, they value consumption. So that's all standard. Then where we have something interesting is on the production side. Once again, unit of production is a plant, but now instead of plants producing units of the final good, in this setup, a plant produces what's called a particular variety. So the plants all produce different things. As in the Hoppenheim model, you create a plant by using some labor, H-bar units of labor, to create one plant. Once you create the plant, it can then produce output of a particular variety. And that plant uses labor HI to produce output YI of variety I. There's this Z out in front. And note that this production function I have as constant returns to scale, in contrast to what we had in the Hoppenheim model. I could actually make this decreasing returns to scale, but that's actually not required, whereas in the Hoppenheim model, that's kind of key. And in most versions of this model, you'll see that constant returns to scale is used. But then the extra detail here, remember all of these plants in the Melitz model are producing different varieties. Now, how do we aggregate those varieties into the final output? And here's the production function that aggregates the production of all the varieties into a final good, which is what the household consumes. And here you can see it's a CES aggregator. And the assumption is that these things are substitutes, so that rho is between 0 and 1. So again, looks a lot like the Hoppenheim model, except now we have, instead of all the plants producing the single final good, here all the plants produce different varieties. They produce with constant returns to scale themselves, but then we aggregate those into the final good. And as I'll show you in a couple slides, in the Hoppenheim model, the decreasing returns to scale in the production function here is a key source of curvature. That's kind of the critical in this model. In the Melitz model or the Dixit-Stiglitz model, there's no you do not need curvature here, and it's because the curvature actually comes in here in terms of these things being substitutes, but not perfect substitutes. The third model, as I said, the Lucas span of control model. Once again, on the household side, this looks pretty much the same. There's one little difference here is previously I said there was a representative household, and in the Lucas span of control model, we have to break that household apart, and we have to talk about there being a unit mass of identical households. Each of these identical households has a unit of time preferences U of C, so that's kind of the same as before. On the production side, unit of production is again a plant, and in the Lucas span of control model, instead of saying that you have a technology for creating a plant, in the Lucas span of control model, the setup is that a plant requires a manager and some workers. And so in some ways you could say all these potential plants exist. So in that sense, you don't have to create them, but to operate them, you have to allocate somebody to be a manager, and then you give them some workers. If a plant has a manager and you give it H workers, it produces this amount here. And just as in the Hoppenheim model, this F is critically decreasing returns to scale. And you might say this kind of looks like Hoppenheim, except there's no H bar. Remember, in the Hoppenheim model, you needed H bar units of labor to create the plant. And here, it doesn't look like you need any labor to create the plant. But in fact, loosely speaking, the fact that you have to allocate a manager in order to operate a plant is a little bit like playing the role of H bar. And so as you'll see in a slide, the Lucas model is a little bit like the Hoppenheim model with H bar equal to 1 in a mathematical sense. So those are 3 static models. And I guess the key element of these models that we're using as our jumping off point are that these are models which by construction allow us to talk about there being multiple units that are producing the aggregate output in the economy. So I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about the implications of these models in terms of allocations. So I'm going to talk about efficient allocations right now. So the way I set up these simple models, everything is symmetric. So conditional upon any of these models, however many plants are created, because all the plants look the same, all the plants are going to be treated identically by a social planner. And so taking that into account, if I said, what are the social planner problems that tell us what efficient allocations are in these economies, the key decision in all of these economies for a social planner is how many plants to either create or operate. I'm going to let that be N. And conditional upon that, that uses up a certain amount of labor. In the Hoppenheim model, if you want to create N plants, you will have had to have allocated N times H bar units of labor to creating plants. In the Melitz model, if you create N plants, which then produce N varieties, you will have used up N times H bar units of labor creating those plants, and what's left over is 1 minus that. And in the Lucas model, if you're going to operate N plants, then you must have allocated N units of labor as managers, and 1 minus N is what's left. Then you take what's left and you spread it evenly. So in the Hoppenheim model, you take what's left, 1 minus N over H bar, divide that evenly across all the plants. This is how much each of them gets. So each of them would produce F of that. And then there's a N out in front because you have N of those plants operating. So this is what you would maximize. I should also have the Z out in front there, but of course Z is just scaling that up, so that wouldn't play any role, but that is a typo there. And in the Melitz model, you get the corresponding expression that then gets fed through the CES aggregator to get something that looks like this. And in the Lucas model, you get that. So that's what a social planner would do. And the key problem for the social planner, how many production units to have. And as a result, once you know how many production units you have, you also know how big each of them will be. So the social planner in these economies has to decide how many production units to have and how big they should be. I won't go through the algebra, but if we take the production function F in the Hoppenheim and Lucas models as y to the alpha, then these are the expressions you get for the optimal number of plants. And you can see in some ways, these kind of all look the same. I told you that Lucas is a little bit like Hoppenheim with H bar equal to 1. And you can see that the expression has exactly that feature. I also emphasized that the Hoppenheim model, curvature is kind of a key feature of that model, and curvature enters through the decreasing returns to scale production function. And you can see that alpha is the measure of curvature, and that measure of curvature shows up in this expression for n. And in the Melitz model, we said there's no curvature in the individual production function, but the curvature comes through the CES aggregator. And you can see that that's dictated by rho. And in fact, rho enters this expression just like alpha up there. What's the economics behind these? You can see, so this, as I say, the social planner has to decide how many units to operate. And as a result of that, how big each of these units is, and what's the economics of what's the fundamental economic trade-off here? Well, on the one hand, creating units, production units, uses resources. In the Hoppenheim and Melitz models, you have to give up H bar units of labor every time you want to create one of these production units. So that seems kind of wasteful. So why would you want to use up resources to create these production units? Well, the reason that you do that is because of the curvature in these models. In the Hoppenheim model, you've got decreasing returns to scale here. And so with this production function, the bigger a unit becomes, the lower its marginal productivity becomes. So you could just create one unit and have a big unit, but if you just had one big unit, you've got all your labor there, and the decreasing returns to scale are really kind of taking a bite out of your production. If you actually said, I'm going to open up a second unit, then by virtue of opening up a second unit, you then go back to taking advantage of the fact that marginal product of labor is very high when a unit is small. And by spreading labor over more units, you're able to avoid some of the decreasing returns to scale. And so the key trade-off in these models is you avoid the decreasing returns to scale, which in the Melitz model comes from the curvature, the substitutability across the varieties. In the Hoppenheim and Lucas models, it just comes from this. You're trading off resources used to create units versus facing the decreasing returns to scale. Okay, that's what a social planner would do. Often we're interested in thinking about decentralized equilibria in these sorts of models. I'll just mention that if you look at how these are done in the literature, in the Hoppenheim model, the standard equilibrium notion is competitive equilibrium. You can do other things, but that's kind of the standard. You'll notice when people write down Melitz style models, the standard equilibrium notion is not competitive equilibrium. It's monopolistic competition in the market for the varieties with perfect competition elsewhere. As I put on the slide here, why? In some ways, they do that because they kind of have to. And the reason for that is if you've got constant returns to scale at the variety level, and there's a fixed cost, it turns out that a competitive equilibrium in that economy would never exist. So they actually have to deviate from competitive equilibrium in order to have a well-defined notion of a decentralized equilibrium. And so monopolistic competition is standard. And Lucas model, once again there, it's standard to just talk about a competitive equilibrium. You can do other things, but you don't have to do something different, I guess is one way to think about it. As I note at the bottom here, in these models with inelastic labor, all of these decentralized equilibria generate efficient allocations. So those social planners problems are what would happen. So quick summary of what I've shown you so far. So all three of these models endogenously determine what we can call the intensive and extensive margins of production, the numbers of producers and the size of each producer. In these simple models, kind of an appealing feature is that the producer's size distribution turns out to be degenerate. That is, all the producers in the models I've introduced so far are going to be the same size. So the size distribution is degenerate. Now, critical to this was that in that analysis so far, all plants had the same value of Z, the plant level productivity parameter. Now, in fact, as a As an empirical matter, there's massive literatures out there. Chad Syverson has a nice review paper in the Journal of Economic Literature you could look at, but a robust empirical finding is when economists look even within narrowly defined industries in given economies, they find large cross-sectional dispersion in Z. And so the next step is for us to introduce that heterogeneity in Z that we actually see in the data into these models in order to to produce models in which we get non-degenerate size distributions. And this is going to be critical as an input into thinking about the misallocation issue we talked about, because the essence of misallocation has to do with the fact if you've got heterogeneous producers, and a critical aspect of resource allocation is how do resources end up being allocated across those heterogeneous producers. And so the next step is to add heterogeneity into both of these frameworks. Now, when you start adding heterogeneity, there's kind of two different ways you could introduce it. As I say here, ex ante versus ex post. And the distinction has to do with, is the ZI observed, if each plant is going to have its own productivity parameter Z. The question is, do you observe this after the plant is created? What I said after and after in both cases, that's a typo. Ex ante means you observe before the plant is created. Ex post means ZI is observed after the plant is created. So sorry about that typo. As I say on the slide, this is not a question of right or wrong. There's good reason to think both of those are plausible. But what I want to point out is that the choice matters in terms of the economics associated with it. So there's slightly different economics associated with each of those. As I mentioned here in Hoppenheim and Melitz, the benchmark models typically have all the heterogeneity being ex post heterogeneity. In the plants, you use H-bar units of labor to produce a plant. And then after you allocate that labor, then the ZI is a random draw. So you create the plant, but you only find out how good the plant is after you've created it. The Lucas-Spanner control model, in contrast, traditionally assumes ex ante heterogeneity, and they actually typically call it heterogeneous manager ability. And so the high ZI people become managers. And the key issue in terms of ex ante versus ex post is if you know the ZI before you create a plant, then there's actually selection issues in terms of which plants you choose to create. So let's embellish those models that we talked about with heterogeneity. So I'm going to start with adding ex post heterogeneity into the Hoppenheim model. So in the Hoppenheim model, in this extension, if we create a plant, again, it uses H-bar units of labor, but now we're going to get a draw ZI from a distribution with a density G. So all of these models I'm talking about assume that there's lots of plants. It's like technically there's a measure of plants. So we start with a lot of households. We allocate a certain fraction of the labor. And because we're going to have a large number of plants and the draws are IID across plants, this means we basically have a law of large numbers. So from the perspective of a density, the distribution of Z across plants that we create is just going to replicate the density from which these draws come from. If you create twice as many plants, then you'll just have twice as many plants of each Z. So you just kind of scale this up. So this is kind of key when I said the heterogeneity is all ex post. If you produce twice as many plants, the average quality of the plant in terms of the average Z is unaffected. You just get more of everything. In this problem, the social planner now has a slightly more interesting problem. This social planner has to decide how many plants to create, but because the plants that it creates will now have different Z's, this social planner also has to decide how to allocate the remaining labor to those plants. And so a plant of productivity Z is going to get H of Z units of labor. And so what's the social planner's problem? The social planner's problem, this is going to be the total output that gets produced. As I said, so the distribution of plants is going to mimic the distribution that they draw from, the G of Z. If you give a plant of type Z, H of Z workers, that plant will produce Z, H of Z to the alpha units of output. We integrate across the density. And then, as I said, the more plants we create, we just kind of proportionately increase this. And here's the key constraint on labor, which is the mass of plants you create, H of Z times G of Z. This is the labor allocated to a plant of type Z. You integrate across the density. So this is the total labor that's allocated across the plants, scaled up by the number of plants. And that has to be how much labor is left over after you've taken out the labor used to create the plants. Okay, so this is a more interesting social planner's problem, because in this problem, the social planner has to decide both how many plants to create and how to allocate labor across those plants. The rule, the first order condition that would come from this social planner's problem is that the social planner would equate the marginal product of labor across all the plants. If that's not true, then the social planner would reallocate. And this is just the condition that says that's constant. In terms of solving this model.
May I ask the question?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so in the ex ante and the ex post thing, so do those ZI represent different things, or are they really representation of the same true ZI in the two kinds of models?
You can do that kind of in a general way. They can be distinct. You could have multiple dimensions of Z, and one dimension could be differential, have ex ante heterogeneity, and the other one could have ex post heterogeneity. So they need not be, you could have multiple dimensions of the plant level productivity. And
so
some
in
of
the
those
end,
dimensions,
when we are going to answer some questions about the misallocation or the aggregate productivity, those are bound to be different. Those results will have to be interpreted differently when we go through different models, right?
That's true. So, in terms of the model, the details of the environment that you specify influence what efficient allocations look like. And so those details definitely matter. And so at a general level, you have to specify what those details are. We'll see that.
In the ex ante, it seems more like the managerial ability and how those are, whether efficient people are setting up the plants. And in ex post case, it more looks like a technology-based thing, that whether your production was efficient or not, and whether people who produced finally were efficient or not. And in the ex ante case, it is whether the efficient people started the business or not. So these are actually measuring different kinds of things. Like that, they're completely two different dimensions of productivity that these are capturing.
Yes, just to connect them, you could imagine, take the Lucas span of control model, and with the interpretation that the ZI is the managerial quality, I could extend that to say that, yes, managers differ, people differ ex ante in their managerial quality, but then even conditional upon choosing a manager with a high ex ante quality, when I actually put them in a particular plant to manage, there will still be a random draw on top of that. And so both of those things will be present, and the total productivity could be either the sum or the product of those two. So as I said, there's no right or wrong that it's either or. There's a sense in which in reality we could easily imagine both of those things are present.
Yeah, these are like superimposed upon each other. These
yes,
cannot really be separated, I think.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so in terms of solving this simple model, I have a few steps here, and I see I'm kind of not making that good a time in terms of getting through the material I was hoping to get. But let me just say that in terms of solving this model, you can kind of do it in 3 steps. So you can solve for the maximal output conditional upon a unit of labor being available and the distribution of plant productivities being equal to this, which is what the distribution will necessarily look like. Call this y of 1. Then it turns out that the efficient allocation of labor that equates marginal products means that this condition is satisfied. And the key point here is if I gave you twice as much labor to allocate across a given distribution of firms, each H of Z scales with the total labor because nothing happens to the total amount of labor has no impact on the relative amount of labor, which means if there's twice as much labor to be allocated, then everybody gets twice as much labor. And so that means that total output just scales up H to the alpha times that y of 1. And then you can solve for the optimal number of plants to create by noting that total output looks like this. And in some ways, this says that this Hoppenheim model with the ex post heterogeneity kind of looks a little bit like the Hoppenheim model without heterogeneity, where Z is just equal to this y of 1, which takes into account the efficient amount of output you get from allocating labor across the units. Now I'm going to talk about adding an element of ex post heterogeneity into the Hoppenheim. This is just one way to do this, but I want to do this to illustrate a model where you've got both margins present. And so one way to do that in the Hoppenheim model is I'm going to split that H bar into 2 parts, one part called H bar E and the other part called H bar F. And what I want to say is that creating a plant in the first place requires HE bar units of labor, and it gives you a random draw from G of Z. But then having created the plant, if you actually want to operate it, that's where this second component of the fixed cost comes in. And you only have to pay this cost H bar F if you choose to operate the plant after creating it. And this gives rise to a selection margin. So now this is a model that has both of those elements. And I have the social planners problem here, but I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to walk you through the details there. But the key point is now a social planner has to decide how many plants to create. And then having created them, it sees the productivities. And now it has to decide which of these plants to operate and which not to operate. And so in some ways, there's an additional margin to the social planners problem, which is which plants operate. And in the simple framework I have here, the plants that operate, you will equate marginal product of labor across those plants, and there will actually be a simple threshold rule, a selection rule for which plants operate. You only operate plants above some Z star. So these are the multiple margins in the social planners problem. So I've kind of introduced heterogeneity into the Hoppenheim model just to make it concrete. You can do this in the Melitz and Lucas model in just kind of an analogous way. I'm not going to go through that detail. I just want to make one more comment about decentralizations in these environments with heterogeneous firms. And this is a distinction which is kind of important in terms of taking these models to the data. So if you do competitive equilibrium in Hoppenheim and Lucas, all the production units are producing the same good. And so in a competitive equilibrium, there's a single price for a single good. And so the price of the output that's produced by all these units will be the same. In the Melitz model, when there's no heterogeneity, then everybody charges the same price because everybody charges a markup over their marginal cost. But because there's no heterogeneity in marginal cost, there's no heterogeneity in prices. But when you introduce heterogeneity into the Melitz model and different production units have different Z's, so different productivities, that means that different units have different marginal costs. If prices are a fixed markup over marginal cost, you also get heterogeneity in prices. And so, as I say, that'll just be useful for us to kind of store in the back of our minds for some points I'm going to make a little bit later. This is just kind of summarizing some of what I said about the dimensions of efficient allocations. And as I kind of want to make the point here, if you start with an aggregate production function and labor is the only factor of production, as in the models we've been talking about so far, there's kind of just nothing to be said. You just tell your workers to go to work and you get the output you get. There's kind of nothing interesting in terms of something that happens in the economy that's going to influence how much output you get. In the Hoppenheim model, without heterogeneity, the first model we talked about, there's a non-trivial decision about how many plants to operate and how big the plants should be, and different choices. And there's the social planner, there was an optimal number of plants to create, and hence an optimal size of plants. If you deviate from the optimal choice, you'll have a suboptimal level of output in that economy. So there's already one interesting decision there. How many plants to operate? How big should they be? When we went to the Hoppenheim model with ex post heterogeneity, there's actually an additional dimension. In addition to deciding how many plants to create, after the fact, the social planner also has to allocate labor across those plants. And so you could also deviate from the efficient level of output by having the wrong allocation of labor across those plants. And then lastly, when the Hoppenheim model with both ex ante and ex post heterogeneity, an additional dimension is which plants are operating, which plants are not operating. So in this Hoppenheim model with ex ante and ex post heterogeneity, you have this rich set of decisions which need to be made in the economy, which are going to influence the total amount of output in the economy. And this is true holding the access to technology in a sense fixed. So in the interest of time, I think I'm going to go a little bit quick here, but I just want to, so far I did everything static. So I just want to talk about how to embed that into a dynamic framework, because in some settings, the dynamics will be particularly important. So I'm just going to do this for the Hoppenheim model. So I'm going to have a representative consumer. So this will be like a version of the solo growth model, but instead of having an aggregate production function, we're going to build the production up from all these individual units which get created over time. So as in the standard solo model, we don't change anything on the household side, a representative consumer, preferences that look like this, endowed with 1 unit of time. All the action is on the production side, and you'll see this is going to look a lot like the basic building blocks we just talked about. So the production unit is a plant level production function looks like this. So I've now extended to include capital and labor both as inputs. Key is that F has decreasing returns to scale, and K and H. We need some curvature here because kind of the essence of the Hoppenheim model is that it wastes resources to create plants, but the reason you're willing to waste those resources is because each plant has decreasing returns to scale. So that's kind of a fundamental trade-off in these models. So I now have this Z in front of a plant. I'm now going to assume that this Z evolves stochastically over time. And I'm just going to make it a finite Markov chain. You can make this a continuous process if you want. Notationally, with a Markov chain, you can just describe it with a matrix. So that's kind of nice and convenient. And then the Z for a particular plant is observed at the beginning of the period before they make any decisions. So now in terms of the entry and exit, which kind of gets to the things we talked about before, there's a fixed cost H bar F in units of labor if a plant wants to remain in existence. That's like that operating cost we talked about previously. And then there's a fixed cost H bar E in units of labor to create a new plant. And if you create a new plant, you have to say, where does the plant start from in terms of its Z? And that's just like the models I talked about earlier. That Z is going to be a random draw from some distribution with a density G on that finite set of Z values. Those draws are IID across plants. So as I say, this kind of just takes that static structure we talked about, puts it into a dynamic setting in the context of the growth model, a model that accumulates capital. And then the one little twist I've added is to allow for the, oops, sorry about that, a plant is created, it draws a Z, and then in a multi-period model, we allow for the possibility that that Z evolves stochastically over time. So that's the model. And as I say, this model is like the one sector growth model, except it has this richness on the production side, where instead of me just plopping down some aggregate production function, I now build up the total output produced in this economy by talking about the output produced by a whole bunch of individual plants. At any point in time, these plants are heterogeneous in their productivities. On top of that, they also evolve stochastically over time. So if you follow plants over time, you'll see that some plants grow, some plants shrink, some go out of business, new plants are created. So it's a model which has the beauty at an aggregate level of something that looks like the one sector growth model, but it also has this richness in terms of what goes on the production side. And just as the static models we talked about have this rich set of dimensions for what it means to have an efficient allocation, this model will inherit those features as well. So in the slides, I guess the slides will be available to all of you. I kind of go through some of the formalism of describing the recursive competitive equilibrium for this kind of elaborate version of the one sector growth model with this richness on the technology side. So I think, the slides are available, and I'm going to let you kind of go through, peruse those later. Let me just say that to kind of extend some of our earlier discussion, I'm going to talk right now about a steady state. So in a steady state, there'll be some wage rate and some rental rate of capital. There'll be some aggregate labor, there'll aggregate capital stock, there'll be some aggregate labor that's used. But then kind of the interesting element of this model is kind of the rich set of heterogeneity on the production side. So in a steady state, there'll be this invariant distribution of plant level productivities. There'll be a massive entry each period. There'll be some plants that exit, so there'll be an exit rule for plants. And then in terms of the total capital and total labor, there'll be an allocation of that across plants which differ in their values of Z. So that's kind of the core of this model. I'm going to skip the definition. I also have some slides on how easy it is to solve for the steady state, which I'm actually also going to skip over in the interest of time. And this is kind of key in terms of setting the stage for the misallocation literature, or more generally, using these models to think about differences in aggregate TFP, because in this model, we can now think about all the things which might differ across two economies that might give rise to differences in aggregate TFP. And so the first thing to note, I said that mu star of Z is the distribution of productivities across plants in an economy. And those, when plants are created, they draw from G. So one thing you could say is, suppose two economies have different Gs that they draw from. And you might say, well, this maybe is one way to capture that some economies are kind of away from the technological frontier. They're not using best practices, so that the new plants that are created are kind of in some productivity sense, in a stochastic sense, worse than the plants that get created elsewhere. So this is like just saying, embedding it directly into, yes, plants are kind of plant by plant. Plants that get created in one country are worse than in another plant in terms of productivity. That's going to ultimately feed into the equilibrium distribution of plants across Z. There could be something about the stochastic evolution of productivity that maybe you start a plant, and then if a plant is accessing modern technology and best practices, there's a sense in which it gets on a particular trajectory, and maybe that differs across countries. So this is like kind of hardwiring things through technology. But then the core of the misallocation literature is to say, in this sort of model, that's not the whole story. There's actually these kind of really important other decisions, or potentially important other decisions. How do you allocate, even taking the distribution of the Z's as given, how do you allocate labor across the different Z's? How do you allocate capital across the different Z's? How do you decide which plants to close down? So these are all decisions that will influence how much total output you produce, even taking the distribution of the Z's as given. And so, as I say down here, distortions that affect the ability or incentive of firms to adopt frontier technologies or use them, those kind of show up in 1 and 2. But distortions that prevent resources from being directed to their most productive uses kind of show up here. And so this is a model which kind of lets you look inside the black box of the aggregate production function into the different things which might give rise to measure differences in aggregate TFP. And so that's kind of the jumping off point, in a sense, for the misallocation literature. As I say here, just summarizing from the previous slide, in an economy with producers that are heterogeneous in productivity, the allocation of inputs across producers will emphasize measured aggregate TFP. So the idea is you could have two economies that plant by plant look identical in terms of the productivities, but if in one of these economies they do something bad in terms of how they allocate resources across those plants, one of these economies will produce less output than the other economy, even though they have the same amount of capital and the same amount of labor. So that will show up as a difference in measured aggregate TFP. And so the second point I mentioned here, which is, even before one does anything to try and put numbers on anything, just as you're thinking, could this be plausible? As I say here, there's countless examples of the things that governments do that kind of are associated with what we might think of misallocating inputs across producers. And I mentioned here kind of corruption or crony capitalism, that in this happens in all economies, but I think, if you just kind of read press reports and stuff, less developed economies where institutions are not so strong, corruption is more present, slash crony capitalism. You've got people running firms who shouldn't be running them, but they're well connected, so they're getting access to either government contracts, low interest loans from the government, tax exemptions. So So it's easy to think about all these things which go on in less developed economies, which probably show up as misallocation and which then feed into differences in TFP. And so the idea is to say something about how important that might be. And so having kind of laid the groundwork there, I want to talk about two papers which have tried to put some numbers on this. So the first one is a paper by myself and Diego Restuccia, Red 2008. And I'll go a little bit quickly here just because time is quickly passing. So what Diego Restuccia and I did was the following. We took one of these kind of, actually a little bit of a simple Oppenheim style model, and we actually just said the following without trying to connect to reality. You write down one of these models and you can see conceptually these models have the potential to create differences in aggregate TFP due to kind of messing around with how you allocate labor across heterogeneous production units. And so what we did was, I say, very simple-minded. We kind of said, let's just kind of take one of these models and just explore how easy it is to get big differences in TFP from messing around with things that way. Do you end up with big differences or small differences, just as a way to kind of get a sense of, are we in the ballpark for thinking about things? So we took as I say, a little bit of a simple version of the Oppenheim model relative to what I just told you. We took inelastic labor supply. This was the plant level production function that we postulated. We kind of got rid of the action on the exit margin by just saying that there's one of the Z's is actually equal to 0, and that's an absorbing state. So that's the sense in which we have exit, but we had the fixed operating cost we actually set to 0. And then exit kind of happens because there's a probability lambda that you go to this absorbing state. So it's basically a very...
I have a fundamental question. So,
sure.
Yeah, so when you said that suppose two countries have similar distribution of productivity across plants, but just due to different allocation of inputs, one is able to produce more and another is not able to. But
Yep.
that is a static view of the economy. It might be that the government and the market disciplined in another economy, and so the allocation was a bit distorted. But say down the line, say 5 years from now, that it is better for that economy. So are we taking into account this dynamic effect of the market disciplining or the government actions? Or is it just one-time view of the allocation we are interested in?
So, I mean, at a general level, the framework I've laid out can handle the broad dynamic question you're talking about. So so you can have some policies, you have to...
So you will aggregate the output across years and then say about some aggregate output. Is it so?
Well, I would say it differently, that, one of the reasons we like, if you're thinking about policies where there are dynamic effects, then a dynamic model allows you to talk about, the policy happens today and we can trace out the effects over time. So we don't have to literally add them up. We can actually trace out those effects, and then we can, we can compute the effects period by period and trace out the dynamics. I was just, what I focused on in my words was just, we could take two economies in steady state, both of them can be in steady state, and by virtue of being in steady state, the aggregates are not changing over time, and then we could compare the TFP, those steady state TFP levels. But that's just one particular context in which you can make that comparison. If you have economies that are not in steady state, then you might also be interested in not just the point in time, but the dynamics. And these frameworks allow you to do that. But you'll see that the two examples I'm going to talk about today from the literature were both just kind of looking at point in time. But as to your question, you shouldn't think that the logic of these of misallocation and these frameworks can only be used to talk about those static things.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so that's the setup. So then we calibrate this model. I'll say a standard calibration. I'm not going to go through the details, but again, the object here was to say, let's take a plausibly calibrated version that kind of mimics the aggregate facts, because the Hoppenheim type model at an aggregate level looks like the one sector growth model. So we want parameters so that at that level, it looks standard. And then the novel feature relative to the one sector growth model is what happens at the firm side. So then the idea is to parameterize things so that you get something that looks like a reasonable firm size distribution and firm dynamics. So we did that. And then, as I said, the idea is get some sense as to how big of effects you could get on TFP by distorting allocations across firms. And the way we did this was as a kind of a stand-in. We said one way to think about distorting allocations across individual producers, and this kind of is motivate a little bit if you're thinking crony capitalism or corruption, that some producers are getting favored treatment. This is like having individual taxes or subsidies on producers. And so that's how we're going to achieve this, this distortion or this misallocation. And so we did this in a very highly parameterized way, where we said that we're going to have one group of producers that gets a subsidy, another set of producers that gets a tax, and that's going to distort the allocations across these producers. And then does that produce big effects or small effects? And so we actually considered two different specifications, which we called uncorrelated and correlated distortions. And the idea is the uncorrelated case was that the tau is independent of Z. So there could be, loosely speaking, some people are connected with the government and some people are not. But how connected you are with the government is kind of independent of how productive you are. And so whether you get taxed or subsidized has no correlation with the Z. And the second case is where tau is correlated with Z. And again, I'm not using my time very well, so I'm going to race ahead a little bit. Here's kind of the key numbers. And I guess I'm going to have you focus on just the second row here. So this is the case of the uncorrelated distortions. And this is the tax rate that's on the people who are being penalized, and the corresponding tax rate for those being subsidized is chosen so that the steady state capital stock stays unchanged. Anyways, this relative TFP basically says that you can, there's a sense in which going to 0.4 is kind of maxing out the distortion, because at that point you've kind of reallocated all the resources. And the point here is you can get a TFP difference of about 8% there. And the message we kind of took away from that is that if you mess around with things, but even if you do it in a crazy way, but it's kind of completely random, although you can get some effects, that 8%, when you're talking about the level of living standards between richest and poorest countries, is actually not that powerful. The next exercise is do this where we're now taxing the productive and subsidizing the unproductive. And now you can see when you max that out, you start to get TFP differences on the order of 30%. Again, that's not going to get you all the way to the productivity differences we see across rich and poor countries, but that gives you kind of a big chunk. So that actually seemed kind of promising. So the punchline from this was that if the nature of misallocation is that you're shifting resources from high productivity to low productivity establishments, then there's scope for that to be pretty powerful in terms of aggregate TFP. And I do want to emphasize in these models with heterogeneous production units, there's a tendency to think, oh, if you're moving resources from high productive to low productive, that must be bad. And it suggests, oh, maybe it would be good if we moved resources from less productive to more productive. But I want to emphasize in these models with decreasing returns to scale, there's an efficient allocation across units. And it's not that you want to move all the resources to the high Z units because decreasing returns to scale kick in. And so it's also true, starting from an efficient allocation, if you just said, let's subsidize the high productivity people and tax the low productivity people, that would also be bad for aggregate TFP. It turns out that won't have very big effects, in part because there's not that much scope for misallocation relative to an efficient allocation there, because most of the labor is already in the high productivity units. So in the time remaining, I'm going to go for another 7 minutes or so. So this was all saying it looks like there's scope for this to potentially matter. But now the question is, let's try to say something about, does it really matter in the real world? And so critical for that is getting some sense as to how much misallocation exists in the world. So those previous exercises I talked about were just inventing misallocation and saying, if we had misallocation, could we get big effects? The key question is there a lot of misallocation in the real world? So how are we going to make headway on that? I want to talk about two different approaches, a direct versus an indirect. The direct approach, which is kind of a natural one to follow, is pick a source of something which you think creates misallocation, try and go out in the world and measure it and feed it into the models. One large literature that has done that is a literature on imperfections in capital markets to try and measure those differences across countries that limits the efficient allocation of capital across units and get a sense of how big those are. An alternative approach, which I call the indirect approach, is to say, let's not worry about what the source of misallocation is. Let's just try and measure the amount of misallocation without identifying the underlying source. So what's the pros and cons here is that you might like the direct approach because you actually have taken a stand on what is causing the misallocation, and so you can trace it to the underlying source. The disadvantage of the direct approach is if you think that a lot of the misallocation is coming from things that we might loosely call corruption or crony capitalism, or from a whole diffuse set of institutional features, then there may not be one easily measured single factor which causes it. And so the benefit of the indirect approach is that it allows you to cast a wider net rather than focusing on one particular thing that you might be able to measure. So I want to, the indirect approach is what Shea and Klenow used. And so I want to talk briefly about that before I talk about their results. And so the indirect approach, as I say, rather than trying to take a stand on where misallocation comes from, it says, let's just try and measure how much misallocation there is. And the key idea in this is, as I've mentioned a couple times, in these models I've written down, efficient allocations, the simple Hoppenheim model I talked about earlier, efficiency required that marginal product of labor was equalized across those units, which is a condition that looks like this. And then it means if this condition does not hold, then we have misallocation. So we basically could just look for violations of that condition. And the bigger the violation, the more the misallocation. Now, how do you identify those violations? Well, if you take a stand on functional form, on the functional form for the production function, and in particular the y to the alpha that I had talked about before, it turns out that equating marginal products also means that you equate average products of labor. So if you actually have data on output at plant level and labor at the plant level, then you can actually check for violations of this, and you can actually just assess how much misallocation there is. And in fact, just to make that concrete, suppose I posit this production function at the plant level, yi is equal to zi hi to the alpha. And so now this is like a snapshot in time. And you take a stand on what alpha is. Suppose I give you data at the plant level on output and labor, then total output in the data is equal to this, total labor is equal to that, and TFP in that data with a one factor interpretation is y over h. And so if we could solve for the zi, we could then solve for the level of output that would result if we allocated labor efficiently, call that y star. And then the point is, if you've got data on y and h, and you take a stand on the production function, you can actually back out the zi's. So you can just solve for zi that way. Once you know the zi's, you can, in a sense, solve the social planner's problem and say, given you've got this much labor, what's the most output you could generate? And you can solve for y over y star, and that's the effect of misallocation on TFP. And implicitly, y star will be bigger than y as long as yi over hi is not constant. That is, marginal products are not equated. So one issue that we have to talk about in the context of this is the following, that at the heart of this method is the fact that an efficient allocation has this property. If this doesn't hold, then we conclude there's misallocation. Another way to spin this is that we have a model which implies this. We go to the data, and then you find that that doesn't hold. And then the question is, does that mean your model's not good, or does it mean that there's some misallocation? And that's a little bit of a deep question for this so-called indirect approach, in that it identifies misallocation as departures from some of the conditions that the model implies would hold if there were not any misallocation. And again, it could be that the model is not specified properly, as opposed to there actually being misallocation. So that's a danger. How should I do this, given I've not used my time very well? I think I'm gonna say the following. So that's kind of the essence of things. I mentioned earlier that
Richard, if you take 5 more minutes, and if you can stay for 5 more minutes to questions, we can go 5 minutes late. Does that work out? Does that help you?
That helps me. So let's do that. I'll take a few more minutes then, and we'll have the questions after the time. Okay, so as I mentioned before, in a Hoppenheim or Lucas model, where you assume that there's just a single good, then there's a single price. And an issue in terms of taking these models to the data is that when I did that previous description, I said, suppose I give you data on yi and hi. But in fact, you never really have data on yi. Yi is the physical output produced. Microdata, what it usually gives you is pi times yi. So the price times, you basically get a measure of sales, so or revenue. So that's what you get there. If you kind of go to the data with the Hoppenheim model and assume that the p's are all the same, then knowing if the p's are all the same, then you can infer relative outputs because the p's cancel. And it turns out that's all fine. But kind of a key question is, if you think when you go to the data that there's actually heterogeneity in p's, then the Hoppenheim model is actually not very good for connecting to the data, because it kind of embeds a kind of a serious specification error. And so to the extent that people think that different plants are producing slightly either different varieties, or you might think different qualities of a particular good, it suggests that we need to think about price heterogeneity. And for that reason, in many applications, including the Shea Cleanow that I'm going to still get to today, the Melitz framework is kind of the dominant framework for connecting to the data. So in some ways, the underlying economics are kind of almost the same, but there's this extra detail which turns out to be relevant when connecting to the data, that we need to be mindful of the fact that prices might differ. And so it turns out you can also do all of what I did in a Melitz style model. So this is the basic Melitz model that I talked about. And the key thing here is that in a Melitz style model, if we said what holds in an efficient allocation, it turns out that an efficient allocation, the average revenue product of labor will be equated across producers. So in the Hoppenheim model that I talked about, we had no PI and PJ. That was, those P's are the same, so they cancel. So he said that YI over HI is equal to YJ over HJ. And we said going to the data with that is kind of a little bit misguided if we think there's heterogeneity in P's. When we extend to the Melitz model, the implication of that model is that an efficient allocation will have the property that PIYI over HI is equal to PJYJ over HJ, because the data we see PI times YI and we see HI, we can actually evaluate this in the data without being worried that we've imposed something highly counterfactual in terms of not allowing for prices to differ. So this gives us an alternative simple condition for identifying misallocation. Now this can be generalized to a setting where there's both labor and capital. And in that setting, it turns out the implication is that you can, an efficient allocation is going to equate average revenue product of labor across plants and average revenue product of capital across plants. On the slides, I talk about how it is that you can, just with data on revenue, capital, and labor, you can actually also back out the Z's at the plant level using the demand system that corresponds to the CES. And you can do this calculation once you've computed the actual Z's. You can compute what a social planner would do in terms of total output. So I got that in the slides, so I won't talk about that. What I want to do next is talk about the Shea and Cleanow paper, which is in the general essay. So the Shea and Cleanow paper, as I say, is the kind of the single most important paper in the misallocation literature. And this paper did two things. First of all, it basically developed the methodology that I've worked through, where it said, you give me data on revenue at the plant level, labor at the plant level, and capital at the plant level, and I will actually tell you how much misallocation there is. So it's basically, you give me that data. They created this framework for how to take that data, uncover the ZIs, implicitly uncover the distortions and also calculate how much extra output we could get from allocating things efficiently. And having developed that methodology, they then said, let's take this methodology and we're going to look at the manufacturing sectors in China, India, and the US, and we're going to evaluate the extent of misallocation in these three economies. And the key finding, the reason this paper is so important, is the key finding was that misallocation is big, and in particular, it's much bigger in China and India than in the US. So just to kind of go back to where we started today's lecture, the key insight is that misallocation does seem to be an important component of differences in aggregate, or in this case, aggregate manufacturing TFP across countries. And I'll just show you a couple, I'll just show you, here's kind of the key. Well, I'll show you, this is a picture. This is the distribution of TFP R across these three countries. Is an efficient allocation. There would be no spread in any of these. And the key point here, even in the United States, this thing is far from degenerate, but you can see in India and China, there's actually much more dispersion. The more dispersion there is in this measure, this is like average revenue product, this means there's more misallocation. And then here's the numbers that you attach to this. And so this is showing you the TFP gains from equalizing TFPR within industries. So this is getting rid of all the misallocation. How much extra aggregate TFP could you get? And you can see for China, we're talking about kind of on average doubling things. For India, roughly doubling things. And for the United States, getting an extra 30 to 40%. So that's their key finding. The last thing I want to talk about is just some of these issues, and some of these I suspect Pete will make some additional reference to. So kind of as I say, the Shea cleanout paper is particularly important because it actually put some numbers on misallocation and said it you know, a rigorous exercise to say this is actually a big deal. But as I said, there are some questions in the background. And in particular, because they've used this indirect approach, the question is, are these wedges, these misallocation that they measure, is it evidence of model misspecification, or is it really distortions away from efficient allocations? And I mentioned two possibilities here. So example one, in their model, K over H should not vary across producers in an efficient allocation. But the question is, if we observe K over H varying across producers in reality, is this misallocation, or is it evidence that different producers are using heterogeneous technologies which have different capital intensity? And if they are using at a given point in time technologies with different capital intensities, then an efficient allocation would in fact still have variation there. Second example, in the data, there's always measurement error. And so how do we detect the difference between measurement error and a true distortion? So these are issues the literature has the follow-up literature has addressed. But in terms of the kind of some question marks, when you follow the indirect approach and get these numbers, kind of the general question is, how do we know we've identified true distortions versus either model misspecification or measurement error in the data? As I said, if you follow the direct approach, then you have a bit more confidence that what's coming from the measured differences in policies is actually reflecting misallocation. So I've talked too long. I'm actually going to stop there. Hopefully I've set the stage for Pete next week to kind of get you more up to date. And I will now take questions for a while.
Fantastic. Thanks, Richard. You've got some people to call on in the directly from the front row. I see a question from Raul and a question from Andres.
Okay.
And one from Fatou.
Okay.
Why don't we
Are they
take the
just
three
gonna...
questions in sequence, and then you can answer those three. So Raul, Andres, and then Fatou, and then we'll take another round.
Hello. So my impression from this literature is that when you read, especially those papers at work about the frictions in the capital markets, is that depending on the model you use, even if you abstract from all of the measurement errors, you can get like super different results. So how can we actually assess the fit of this literature to the actual differences in TFP?
Well, I'm not sure. I guess I would ask you to kind of fill in a little bit more when you're saying you get results all over the place. Could you just say a bit more about what you're referring to there?
No, for example, I'm really interested in this literature, and one of the things that I find striking is that, for example, if you read some papers about, for example, studying the role of collateral constraints, as in, I don't know, Midrigan and Shu, for example, but if you read some other papers speaking about some other kind of frictions, you actually find like super different results. So it's hard for me to make some kind of assessment on where we are actually. How do we know these things?
Richard, can I just propose that we collect this set of questions, and then you can answer, use your time and allocate it efficiently?
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so that's one from Raul. Let's have Andres, and then Fatou, and then Jeremy.
Yes, thank you, Richard. So I had two questions, but most important one would be, you showed how sensitive this was to some stuff. How sensitive is this to the entry and exit conditions? Like, you think there's that altering that could represent significant differences? And my other question, and more in general, is how perfect are we assuming these markets are? That's it.
Fatou.
Hello, thank you so much for the lecture. I just had one question, and I was just wondering whether it's possible to extend or to generalize these models, not only to include capital, but also intermediate inputs.
Intermediate inputs?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Jeremy.
I'll stick to one question. We can get kind of a dispersion in the marginal revenue products, but then from there, we want to get some number of, if we got rid of this dispersion, what would the increase in output be? And my understanding is that that kind of relies on whatever the number is we have for the decreasing returns to scale. I'm wondering, how have we estimated that decreasing returns to scale?
Great. Richard, you want to take a stab at those?
Sure, all excellent questions. I won't answer them in order. I'll just say a couple specific things. So first of all, intermediate inputs can easily be added. And in fact, there's recent work, I'll say one of my colleagues at Princeton, Ezra Oberfield, and a co-author, are looking at the extent to which institutional differences across countries feed into how supply chains are created. And depending upon how you do supply chains, that has an impact on whether you source intermediate inputs from elsewhere or you actually produce them internally. And so this is another potentially important margin. So I've kind of shown you the tip of the iceberg here in a model where there's just capital and labor, and that's kind of where all the action is. But you can imagine extending this to think about all the different margins that are involved in production. I'll just say another paper, which I don't know if Pete will talk about it next week. All this has been about just how much capital and how much labor goes to different producers. Another key question is which labor goes where. And so there's a Pete has a paper with 3 other co-authors, which I'm a big fan of, talking about the misallocation of talent, arguing that, factors like discrimination in some settings in some countries, either on gender or race, religion, can influence which people go to which occupations, because there could be barriers there. That would be another important source of misallocation. So in some ways, these models I've talked about today are kind of where the literature started, and it's kind of the tip of the iceberg, but you can think about all the rich set of decisions in a modern economy that involve how you allocate which resources to which activities at which producers. And all of those things are potentially up for grabs in terms of things that could be distorted that might have an impact on TFP. So in terms of, there's a question about the curvature parameter. And I say, in the Hohenheim, it's the decrease in returns at the plant level. I'm going to say that's a parameter which comes up in lots of those models. And I think it's fair to say there are different people who've estimated it, but I would say I don't think it's all that tightly pinned down. So there is an empirical issue there. If you do the Melitz version, the curvature parameter is the elasticity of substitution in the production function. And there's actually a whole bunch of people who have produced estimates of that parameter. So in that formulation, there's actually a large body of empirical work which kind of paints a picture that they think they know what that parameter is. So, things are a little bit blurred across the 2 specifications, but if you follow the Melitz view approach, there's actually quite a bit of evidence to draw on there. Not to say it's definitive, because there's still many issues there, but I'd say there's a fair bit of evidence. And the early question that said, different people are finding different results, I'm going to say, in a certain sense, this is the nature of research in economics. This is a young literature. Even old literatures in economics continue to argue about what the quantitative impact is, but the way we make progress is by being rigorous in writing things down, trying to take them to the data, trying to assess what the quantitative impacts are. That's a process which will go on in time, and it's by building models and understanding which things in those models matter and how to connect those things with the data that we presumably are going to make headway. So I don't think of it as a problem that at current there are different people who've made different assumptions and gotten different answers. This is kind of the part of the progress in terms of economic research, is to get those things out there and then to try and follow up to understand what's going on.
Richard, I have another question for you from Federico Cochen, who says, is there any empirical evidence on how these wedges might evolve over time? So, for example, for the same firm, do they change as time passes? Do we have anything that tries to trace these things through in a dynamic sense?
Yes, and actually, this we could talk about that for quite a while. So there's a paper by 3 or 4 co-authors. I know I'm blanking on all the names right now. Jan de Loker is one of them. It's in the JPE, but it basically was one paper which argues that the Shea cleanout has a lot of misspecification. And the nature of the misspecification they emphasized is they said, let's assume that there's some adjustment costs on capital. And we all know in a model with adjustment costs, you wouldn't, an efficient allocation wouldn't equate the instantaneous marginal product of capital across firms, because you need to take into account the adjustment costs. And in a world where there's idiosyncratic transitory shocks and adjustment costs, you're not going to always move all the capital to equate marginal products, because you understand you're going to have to undo some of that in the future if the shocks are transitory. And so that's a setting in which you don't equate things. Now, if you said, how important are those forces? That kind of gets to the question of you would like to see the dynamic properties of the wedges, because if it's transitory shocks and adjustment costs that's creating the dispersion in average revenue products, there should be a definite time series pattern that you see in terms of how those shocks behave over time. And I would say there's scope for more work on this. You basically would need high quality panel data at the firm level to do this. And there's a limited access, I guess, to those sorts of data sets. So I think it's a key area for additional research. But some of the research that I have seen on that shows that the wedges are actually quite persistent, suggesting that the adjustment cost story is kind of not really a particularly good rationalization for the patterns we see in the data. And the other thing I would say is, on a more substantive note, perhaps, is that in the context of China, where we know that Shea and Klenow do talk about this, they actually find that state-owned enterprises are getting too many resources relative to an efficient allocation, which I think is a result that many people find plausible and intuitive, in some ways lends support to the results they're getting. But then you can look, as China is kind of lessening some of those distortions over time, do you actually see the wedges changing over time? And Shea and Klenow actually find some evidence for those things decreasing over time. On the flip side, India has also made lots of reforms, and the literature to kind of trace out the dynamics of the wedges in India has, I'd say, has found a little bit less supportive evidence for changes that we think are reducing misallocation, that it actually shows up in the wedges. But I would say that's a huge area for future research, is to think about these in a dynamic setting and get access to the data that allows you to think about it, to analyze it systematically.
Thank you so much, Richard. I think we should probably wrap up, given that we've gone a bit over time. I want to thank and congratulate the hardcore of 125 or so participants who stuck with us to the bitter end. Thank you so much again, Richard, for the clarity of the exposition. And thanks, as always, to Mandy Chan and Kirsty McNeil and Lauren Waring from CEPR, who do the back-end stuff that makes these things possible. And again, thanks, Richard, for stepping up and giving us a second lecture here. So we'll look forward to hearing from Pete Klenow next week. And thanks again to everyone. We look forward to seeing you back.